Okay, hopefully everybody is hearing this first introduction. My name is Christopher Navo, and I am starting my very first Authors Alcove, and I picked out two guinea pigs for this series to start me off. Very kind to reach out and accept this offer to do these live streams. I hope this to be a series going forward for something a little fun, a little bit different, to get authors more exposed out in the YouTube book space. So you have the opportunity to pick up some amazing reads. So my guests for episode 1 are Andrew Watson. He is author, booktuber of the Shadowbinders trilogy. And we also have Bryan Wilson. He is the author of the Power of the Stars series. So, guys, I want to just start off. I want you guys to introduce yourselves, to just maybe briefly share a little bit about what you're writing, what it's about, and that initial journey for you. Andrew, if you want to start.
Sure, yeah. My name is Andrew Watson. I am the author of Harbinger of Justice, which is a dark epic fantasy with sort of ancient Egyptian influence. It follows 2 points of view. One is a young girl who lives on the streets, and the other is sort of this mercenary with a dark past. And there's the cover by the amazing Felix Ortiz. And
Beautiful.
Yeah, I am currently working on the sequel. In fact, I hit 150,000 words, and I think I have the epilogue and prologue to go, and then the first draft will be done. So very excited to get that done, start working on edits and making it somewhat readable.
And so Silence of Silver, that's out now, right?
That is. Yes, that is out as well. That is a prequel novella that you can download for free.
And unfortunately, I don't have the second one yet, but it's on my list. So
Thanks.
Bryan.
Hi, I am Bryan Wilson. I am an indie author, relatively new to the scene. I published my first book, Christopher's about to show it, The Forsaken Planet, about a year ago. It's a sci fantasy space opera adventure, and its second one is The Son of the Prophets that just came out this past April, and it's more so just a kind of starts as a contemporary sci-fi. It starts off with characters from our real world, and they are thrust into this extraordinary situation when a alien fleet, I guess you could say, arrives on Earth and begins attacking in and around some of the major cities on the planet. And yeah, it takes off from there. And
Bryan, yours is sort of maybe I think sometimes when we look at especially The Forsaken Planet, it does read off more sci-fi. But I think after I read it, I feel like it does fall under maybe more of a sci fantasy kind of read rather than maybe more a hard sci-fi.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's I've actually been more a predominant fantasy reader in my life, and it was very important to me to kind of try and mesh the two. And I've gotten praise from others that it's one of the more equal 50-50 genre blends that a lot of people have read before. Andrew and I are in the Break-ins group, and we were actually all just talking about recently how it's, we have these sci fantasy books that kind of genre mix is blowing up in itself. And it's a little bit hard to market it, because when you have a cover kind of like mine, The Forsaken Planet, most people are going to see that and think sci-fi, but I do want to give them what is the relevant top, approach to my book, which it's very much a mix of both. And that was kind of my approach with my prologue in the story. You've read it, Chris, and it's definitely seems like a more almost medieval space opera-ish fantasy start in the few pages of it, but then it diverts right from there to transitions to our world, our real world, and the characters that you start to become acquainted with.
Absolutely. And now Andrew's series is a trilogy, so we know of confirmed amount, at least for this particular series. And Bryan, how many do you know kind of where you want to land, or is it kind of still a gray area for you on how many books you want in your series?
I'm currently writing book 3, and at this stage, I have that. I just started writing the first draft, but I have the story pretty mapped out, pretty thoroughly and outlined. I'm hoping to do it in 5. It's not set in stone at this stage. I mean, I have my story encompasses 11 planets with all their own lore and kind of mythologies behind them, and I really want to give a glimpse of all of it. I have a novella coming out at the end of July. I plan to maybe release 1 or 2 of those to kind of help do that. But I'm trying to stick at 5, but it's very well could be 6, maybe even 7. I will not go past 7. That will be my cutoff. I'll make sure it stops there.
That's a good number. Yeah, it's the Harry Potter number. So there you go.
Yeah.
So I guess what for you guys, both of you, what was it the moment that you decided, I need to get a story out. I need to do some writing. I need to get this down on paper or screen, or if you're older like me, on a typewriter in some of my initial pages. Andrew, do you have maybe share some of your initial inspirations, or and then also kind of just where the writing started for you, like kind of an origin for you?
Sure, yeah. So writing was kind of always a thing that I had kind of in the back of my head since primary school. We used to do these exercises where you got given the start of a story and you had to write the end of it. And I always loved that. I thought it was so much fun. And at the same time, I loved reading Rick Riordan at the time, a lot of his Percy Jackson series and his Kane Chronicles books. And I also played a lot of video games. And they were a huge influence on me just wanting to create the same emotional reaction that some of these stories gave me. So I remember one day I was really, really ill. Man, I was home from school, didn't have anything to do, and I went behind our couch where we had a stack of VHS video tapes. I was looking for something to watch, and I was like, The Lord of the Rings. Okay, fine, that sounds not bad. And that kind of, I got obsessed with Lord of the Rings after that. And that was a huge opening into fantasy for me. And then later on in 2020, when everything was kind of closing down and such, when I had lots of free time, I wanted to get back into reading after taking kind of a break over university and high school. And I picked up Mistborn. And that really opened my eyes to what fantasy, well, adult fantasy in particular, because I hadn't really read much adult fantasy up until then. What it could be, just the hard magic system, just getting into the character's head, just the emotions that those books pulled out of me, especially the last one. If you read it, you know what I'm talking about. And then I was thinking, I want to do this. This is something that I want to do. I want to make I want to create that sort of raw emotional feeling that this book and these different types of media caused me.
Was this kind of like your first harbinger of justice? Was that sort of your first kind of major writing, or did you have other maybe manuscripts or anything that you maybe just put aside?
I had a bunch of small short fiction stuff that I kind of wrote and started a couple projects. Nothing really I finished. And then in 2020, when I was working on my honors project in university, I wanted to do writing, and I knew that the world was going to get very quiet for the foreseeable. I decided just to kind of give it a go. So I wrote a sci-fi book actually over 2020, 2021, and then I did revisions and stuff into 2022. And it was my first book. I didn't really have an outline. I kind of went in completely blind, and I didn't even plan for it to be a book. I just had this idea in my head and I just started writing. So it's very difficult to kind of gauge how much a story needs to have for it to be a full-length book. I think I wrote my idea out and it was about 30,000 words. So it was more of a novella. And then I just kind of went, I want to write a book. So I just kept writing. And then without my plan, I did write myself into several corners and try and work myself back out of it, and then did a bunch of editing. But after 2 years of trying to get to work, I was just done with working on that project. And I read a ton of fantasy. So I don't know why my first idea was more sci-fi related, because I've not really read much sci-fi, so I thought, all right, I'm going to write a fantasy book. And ancient Egypt was kind of always this fascinating topic for me, especially in primary school. And it's kind of like the real life fantasy, just because there is so much mystery surrounding it, that I thought I want to do something ancient Egyptian inspired. So in 2022, yeah, it must have been, I started writing Harbinger of Justice and just scrapped the sci-fi thing. I do like a lot of the ideas. I might go back to it eventually, but I wanted my debut to be a fantasy book.
It's funny because I think one of the manuscripts I scrapped was very Egyptian inspired. I studied archaeology and ancient history back in when I first went to college, and
Awesome.
I was very inspired, of course, by all that Mediterranean surrounding area. And I was writing kind of an Egyptian inspired world. And that was kind of, I even, I love the vibes of that when I read Harbinger of Justice, because that was just a unique setting for me too. So yeah, that's awesome. Bryan, same questions for you.
For me, ever since I was a little kid, I just kind of always had this big imagination. I have 2 young kids now, and we were just recently talking about with my mother. They're both animals, my kids, and to the point where I feel like I can't leave them alone in a room because they're going to hurt themselves somehow, some way. And I've always kind of made fun of helicopter parents, but I think in some cases you almost got to be sometimes. But this got brought up because my mother was just recently saying how, like, I was the opposite. I was the type of kid you could just put in a room, give a couple toys, and I'd be making this grand story with them and be chit-chatting to myself. They'd hear me in the room kind of talking and telling this whole grand adventure just with them. And so I've always just kind of had this love, I think, for using my imagination, I guess you could say. And that only grew when I remember 7th grade, we got assigned The Hobbit to read. And that was my first book that I took home. And before that, reading was like, it was just, it was a school project. And when I read that, I just blew through it in the first weekend. I loved it. I went up to my teacher. I said, give me more. What else is like this? And she's, conveniently enough, there's a whole trilogy attached to it. And I blew through that. And later on in early high school, I started reading Ender's Game. That kind of launched me into sci-fi. I love that book. That has a very, very heavy influence on my first book is pretty heavy of a training novel. And it was important for me. My characters take place in our real world. There's a intricate magic system that's all based around. It was important for me for it to be believable, not just in book 1, but in many of the things I have planned down the road in my series, that they come off of our world as really just naive, younger adults. And they, not in 2 chapters, became, novices that are kind of skilled with this. I wanted to really make it believable. And yeah, so that played a heavy influence with the Ender's Game. Then that was around the time when the original Halo games came out. That was, my love for, I've always been really into anything space, the mysteries surrounding it. So I kind of, from there, I just wanted to take my love of reading and form it into writing. I wanted to try something. I wanted to take my love of space, fantasy, all this, and trying to mesh it into its own story, I guess you could say. And on top of that, I've always been kind of obsessed with our world's ancient past, the mystery surrounding it, how we have theories about things, but there's so much we don't know from back then. There's all these societies and cultures. We have these ancient ruins, and we could barely tell you anything about them. And I thought it would be just such a cool idea to take that and kind of mix it into the lore of a story, which is, my Power of the Stars series, the whole lore, mythology. It revolves around this great cataclysm that occurred about 12,000, 13,000 years ago, which is kind of, around the end of the ice age, the last ice age on our planet, where all this mystery kind of starts. So, yeah, that was how it all came together.
It's awesome. Yeah. What did you say, Andrew?
What a segue as well, ending with
I know, right? You're right. A segue.
Perfectly teed up.
Our topic. So one of the things I wanted to do with this series was rather for me to kind of, just bounce questions back and forth with you guys, was allow you guys to bring up the topic you want to talk about. And that's kind of what I wanted to do with this series going forward. And you guys came together and want to talk about the mythology and the world building process of building events that were catastrophic, that have events in what happens in your books. So I guess to start off with, let's start at the beginning for both of you. What came first? Did you like draw a map and then sort of like say, this is the history, this is the cultures of these people, this is the event that happens that puts all of these events that happen in this book into being? And Bryan, of course, you're more of you have an expanded world, being a little more out in with the science fiction aspects of things. But I guess so. Where did you start? Did you just start writing? I know some people can just do that; they can just write as they go. Or was there any planning involved? How did that come to be?
Well, I'm very much like a planner and outliner to my work, but when it first started, it was kind of what I said before. I've always had that infatuation with our ancient culture, and I wanted to try and work that into this story that was this sci-fi fantasy blend. And so I still to this day don't have everything mapped out when it comes to the lore, but I had this overall idea of, it's hard to talk about without going into spoilers of my book, but so semi-spoiler here. But what happens is there was this great event that occurred. Earth used to be part of a grander scheme of planets that humans all lived on. And when this cataclysm occurred, it kind of just changed everything. The other planets decided to leave Earth out of the loop. Earth kind of lost this ability to use what is the magic system in my story, which is called Solera. And there's a reason for all of this, obviously. But when the cataclysm occurred, there's 11 planets. There were 11 people that kind of lifted these planets from the ruins of what was really a great war that occurred at the time. And one of the prophets' names was Earth. It's who our planet is named after. And I always knew I wanted that to be my starting point of meshing our world with these other worlds, building the mythology around it, and building the whole story. On the first book, a lot of things are left vague on purpose. This is, it's the introduction. It's the characters leaving Earth and going to foreign, really futuristic fantasy worlds and having to learn these powers. It really much comes more to the forefront in my second book. And I had a lot of that planned out for years and years and years before I even wrote it in my second book. But yeah, and I have more planned out, how to connect it all, the full story, kind of giving tidbits of exactly what happened and what's going to happen and the plan and how it all comes together. But it's not fully planned out. I think I had a good starting point, but it's grown over time.
What about you, Andrew?
Yeah, so I'm quite similar in that when I was writing Harbinger of Justice, I got a lot of these kind of grander scheme ideas while I was outlining that story. So that story does have a magic system, has a couple magic systems, and does all have this come from this cataclysmic event as well. And kind of what brought that about is tied to the main plot of the story, but it's more of the overarching plot of the trilogy rather than the first book. So while I was kind of writing the first book and outlining the first book, I kind of was thinking about this overlying story. But even the trilogy is the start to this bigger world. So I'm not one to sit down and world build just for world building, but when I'm writing a story, I quite often have ideas that just build on ideas. So it slowly expanded out, and a trilogy became, okay, the trilogy is part of this bigger series, and then it just kind of scaled upward from there. And I don't really take many notes for the bigger A-level stories for the outside the trilogy, but I kind of have it all in my head. But the trilogy is pretty much all planned out because it is tied to this cataclysmic event that happened to this old capital of the country. So we have this what used to be the capital, and for unknown reasons that you find out more about in book 2, the capital, a cataclysmic event happened at the capital, and it's now got this sick wasting bug, the kind of aura around the capital. So whenever flora, fauna, people get close by it, most of them die off. So I actually looked a lot into radiation poisoning and stuff for just kind of like the influence. So even you'll see this more in book 2. Some of the creatures and things that you saw even in book 1 are more mutated versions of them are living around this ancient capital. And then we learn more about what caused the event and why the event happened in the rest of the trilogy.
Yeah, I saw a lot of that when I read the book. I love when you, both of you, can you feel the history, you feel that sense of like longevity too, and what happens with those events in the current state of where we're reading in the books. So when you're creating these worlds, what do you feel like is the hardest part? Do you feel like when you're creating culture or these creatures, what is your plan on how to implement those without maybe or maybe like kind of like we talked about real world influences? And Bryan, your book actually has Earth as its as part of its history, so so more for like Andrew and for the other planets that we explore in your books, Bryan, what do you think is the most challenging on creating those cultures, creatures, and all that?
Well, first, I just want to say I read Andrew's book, and I love that whole cataclysm. That was probably my favorite part of the book, was when they came upon the city, especially the old, I think it was a palace, kind of frozen in time almost. That was, I don't want to spoil it, but that was a really cool scene. So props on that. And for mine, I think my toughest thing is because I've built such a big lore, it's organizing it together enough to keep it all consistent and precise. But B, it's also I have 11 different planets, all with kind of their own lore that I could kind of make the people all with their own personalities. It's very similar to kind of epic fantasies you read, how the different nations are always going to dress a little differently and talk a little differently and act a little differently. It's for me, it's finding enough ways to kind of put this on paper and show it as opposed to tell it, and I guess make it believable in the grand scheme of the reader's mind. Of, I don't want it to seem repetitive and whatnot. And then when it comes to, it's a little difficult for me. I have this space opera book, and in my first book, I do introduce creatures that are non-human. But at the same time, my story is very based around humanity. It's a very central theme that our greatest threat is ourselves, and what we could do. And I want to stick to that. I don't want it to become a story of worrying too much about other creatures, other species. So yeah, I've wrote some fun ones in. I think I had the means to do it in a fun way in my first book, but I'm very much trying to, and I know it's a little odd for space operas. People are going to be thinking aliens and all sorts of monsters and stuff, but I do want to try and keep it more a humanity, trying not to beat itself approach.
Mine is very, very similar to that. Because I'm not really one to sit and world build, most of my creatures or even cultures are very reactive to the setting and the plot. So, for example, there are these huge birds in the most recent novella called Artengo, but they're blue because there's not really much to camouflage in the desert. So it makes complete sense that you would evolve to be blue with the sky to kind of hide yourself from predators. And then I was thinking, right, they will need food to survive if they're huge birds. So I was thinking, what can they eat? Where would they nest? How would that all play out? So a lot of my world building is tied to whatever the plot point in the story I'm at. So even there's creatures in the second book where I didn't have them before I got to that scene in the book, and I was like, right, in this situation, what would the wildlife be like? What could it be like? And it's very similar to cultures as well, with sort of the Teresians. And the other thing that I try really hard to do with cultures and such is try and not make it monolithic. That's probably the wrong word now that I said that. that's not a big cube. That's not what I mean. I mean, don't make it all the same, because people are so different, and there's different groups of people within a same country as well. So if you read the novella, you'll meet the Erdal, who are still in Taris, but they're very, very different types of people. They live below the sands, and even just their philosophy and such is very different from the people who you meet in the main book. So I try to just make it varied, make it interesting, and just make sure it's all tied to the plot, which is one of the reasons. Thank you. Yeah. And at least that way you're not info dumping it, because I do feel like if you spend a lot of time creating all this world building and lore and such, you want to show it off. You're like, I put all this time and it's really cool. So I want to include it, but it's very difficult then to try and include it without info dumping it. So at least if it's reactive and it's more tied to the plot and the characters in the story, even the magic system, I don't know how much I want to give this away, but the shade magic system, it's a shadow magic, and it's to do with creatures that live in people's shadows. This wasn't on purpose. I did think that was just a cool idea, but it's very tied to the themes as well. There are some mental health themes with the shades, and just how all that winded in together. It was kind of by accident. I did the first draft and went, that's quite cool, and then you lean into it on the second and third draft and really flesh it all out. So I do think having that more reactive approach it's what works for me anyway. But even if I think the hardest thing, which was the other question, is the same as Bryan, who's that way, is trying to get all the foreshadowing and like the details for like the bigger scale story, because as soon as it's published, it's locked in. And I'm like, I don't want to miss out on a really good opportunity to include like a little detail here that I might pull on other books. So it's trying to have the foresight to look several books ahead, as well as world building with the plot within the book that you're writing.
Yeah, I think Andrew put it a little more eloquently than I did. That reactive world building, that's definitely something I do as well. You know, I spoke about how I have the different planets. Well, the personalities of the people definitely revolve around, you know, not every planet will be like Earth with sunshine, cloudy days, green grass, blue waters, and not all of mine are. And I definitely kind of revolve the people, how they act. My plan for the future for a lot of these is, especially my novella, you're going to really feel the world there and kind of how I think it impacts the people. And so, yeah, I think that was perfectly said.
I think for me, sometimes working on this and I have 5 different races beside one of them being human, of course, and they each have like own realm or world they live in. Kind of similar with yours, Bryan, where you have to establish like completely different, you know, planet living situations. And why I don't use the word planet, that it is because it is a more magical realm oriented. There's still the differentiation of like the subterranean race lives underground to stay warm, because the heat of their particular sun is only a red dwarf. So, you know, they have to go inside their planet for warmth, you know, etc. like that. So yeah. There are things that I do plan out, but I think there are like certain creatures, of course, I'm like, I write it down just for memory's sake, but to the point of reactive world building, it is something that I don't really focus on until I'm ready for it, kind of thing. And then it's just a matter of maintaining, you know, and keeping that consistent throughout, of course.
For sure. And I think that's a good approach. Personally, I think it's a good approach. You know, mine, you know, I have the 11 planets, and for my first book, I kind of give the emblem that signifies, and each one is signified by a color, and that color is mostly a reason behind the color of the planet, what it's known for, what it's something that's prominent on it. And so, yeah, I had to, when I chose these colors, I had to have somewhat of an idea in my mind of what that representation is going to be. But, I didn't have to flesh it out completely yet. And some still aren't fully fleshed out to this day. Most of them are, but, and I think that's the approach. There's no point, because you might come up, if I came up with an intricate detail for all 11 of them, then I might not be writing about one for 5 books later, which could be 5+ years of my life. So how much of that's going to be forgotten, or how much do I want to have to jot it all down and go back to it later?
I want to take a moment here, a couple questions interluded in here that we can go into, relevant to what we're discussing. Dan from the Black and Blue Collar, have you ever deviated from your initial outline of your story?
You want to go first, Andrew?
Yeah, sure. Yes. No, yeah, I do. Kind of my original thought going into outlining was it has to be this rigid thing. And I was watching a live, I think it was Wizards, Warriors, and Words, which used to be a podcast with Jed Hearn, Michael R. Fletcher, Rob J. Hayes, and Dirk Ashton. And Dirk Ashton made the point that outlines can be a wee bit more flexible and fluid. And one of the things he said is he was writing a book, and then he got to one point, he's like, this isn't right. So he started going a different route, but then he went back to the outline and then re-outlined from that point with this new direction. And I do think it is very difficult to do if you have the whole plot in mind to completely redirect, but it's kind of like minor arcs and things. You can definitely move them about especially while you're writing that first draft. I will say most of the time it's the first draft where I make drastic changes. Most of the time after that, after kind of I got the grasp of the story, and I do think that writing the first draft is you're telling the story to yourself. Can't remember who said that, but someone smart, and I really liked it. So I was like, I'm going to remember that. And so I do think once you've got that first draft down, it's a lot easier to just kind of clean up. And it's usually minor tweaks and things, but usually the story and the characters are pretty set in my mind of what's going to happen. I do think sometimes with beta reader feedback, you do want to tweak things depending on how they react. Like I know Brandon Sanderson wrote Defiant. Was it Defiant? No, it was Cytonic. And then he basically had to rewrite most of it because of the beta reader feedback. So I do think being open to changing things is really important as a writer. Just because you see it doesn't mean that everyone else will see it in that same way. A lot of writing is communicating. So I think being open for beta reader feedback as well is an important point. But for the most part, it's usually the first draft is set for me.
Yeah, my experiences between my 2 books were 2 very different experiences. My first one, I outlined the thing 20 years before I published it. So it definitely didn't go by that first outline. There was a lot of, my first draft was done 12+ years before it was published. So there was a lot of developmental change and cleaning up. And it started as a hobby and, took a very different route once I got serious with it. I'd say my second one is probably more to the course of what I hope my writing will be from here on out. It was definitely similar to the novella I just recently did. But that one I had a pretty thorough outline done. Kind of as Andrew was saying, when I went through the first draft, I got the story. My main focus was get the story down, get what happens down. I can go back in the next draft and kind of add the fine touches, make it maybe a little more beautiful, if you will, add the descriptions and the spots it may be missing and whatnot. But yeah, I did a much better job of, I had the outline, I went as the story went. And yes, as the story did go, I needed to alter some things down the line, but that was a quick thing of retyping it up on my outline and just reprinting that out for when I get to that point. And yeah, that went pretty smoothly for me, definitely much more smoothly than my first book. And it was basically this similar experience for the novella I just recently finished.
I think for me, I have to bullet point items that I want to happen, that are mandatory to happen. But even with those bullet points, despite what I have planned, even if they hit the bullet point, it's characters often take over and go in the direction they want to, and they might hit the bullet point, but not the way I initially intended. So and I've changed, I've changed whole POVs. It's amazing what gets changed, like just in that first part. But as Andrew mentioned, just once you get that first draft done, I think that's kind of just set onto that, and then what changes after that is very minuscule to that.
Yeah, I think it's very, very much your first book. That's what's going to happen in a lot of cases. It gets a little your story's more defined. You have it more defined in your head after that first book releases. So I think that definitely is going to make it easier to stick more to the course, as and you're also stuck with certain rules or certain characters or certain settings, backgrounds, what be it. So yeah.
And that's where, go ahead, Andrew.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, you can't really learn how to write a book without writing a book as well. So I do think, especially with that first book, a lot of things might change. I actually had 2 different characters that ended up, or I think there were one character and they ended up getting split into 2 and things like that. One character I started writing and just their sort of personality wasn't working, so I ended up rethinking kind of who this character is, and they started playing a massive part in the story when they really weren't originally in the outline at all, or if they were a very minor character. And I do think, especially with the first draft, what I do is, just to get it down, is if you're writing a scene and you are making a change, I take a note of the change I'm making, and then I just start from that point as if the change already exists. And that way in the second draft I can come and add it in, and usually it's more to do with that chapter, that scene, rather than huge character changes, because huge character changes would be a nightmare to just change in the middle. But smaller changes, you can just kind of say, right, that's what I'm going to do from here on out, and just kind of get that first draft down, because I think it's a lot easier to, once you have something to mold and change, it's a lot easier than just trying to get right first time.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think trying to get it right the first time is just, you're never going to get it written kind of thing. And I think I was one of those people that made the mistake in my early writing career. Like Bryan mentioned earlier, this first book was over a decade project, and going back and looking over that first draft, it's like, yeah, this is clearly written by me like 12 years ago, and I already have book 2 only because I split book 1 in half, and I have book 3, and I'm looking at my writing in book 3, and it's vastly different from what I had in book 1. So and then for me, I'm just scatterbrained, so I need to make sure I make the notes that everything stays consistent once I make that change, for sure.
Yeah, that was something that definitely occurred with my even my first book being published. I think it definitely, I was fortunate, and it was always a strategy of mine that my first book, I've kind of told people, I feel like it's almost like a prologue or a prequel to my what the series, book 2 and on, is more what the series is going to be about. I think that worked in the favor in my case, because my first book definitely reads a little bit differently, just because a lot of it was written from an older version, probably a little less mature version of myself.
But your characters are young, those too. So I think that works to your advantage in a way, I think.
And for sure. And they're kind of forced to grow up more in the second book. And that, again, that works more, I think, to my advantage now, that being older than I was in the first instance.
And something a little fun here. We have Aaron asking, what would you want to live in the worlds you've created? Bryan, you have like 9 or 11 to choose from.
That's unfair.
Andrew's kind of stuck with his one.
I'm not the biggest fan of our world in general, so if I got 11 to choose from, put me on that ship, and well, I got to be able to bring my family with me. Put me on the ship, and there's quite a few of them I think I'd be happy with.
I think I would too. Because to be fair, the Shadowbinders trilogy is just one country. So I do have some plans for writing books in the other parts of this world, and some of it's nice-ish. There's still going to be like horrific monsters and things running about, but
there's not all radiation waste pouring out of places.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, for me, in the human realm, there are like different continents of different cultures. I'm not a person for heat. So where your books currently take place, Andrew, I would not really be.
Yeah, same. I'm not sure
I wouldn't do well there. But
I think that's what makes good writing, though, is we're all kind of writing places we enjoy, places we like, places we kind of could see ourselves in. So that's kind of what makes the atmosphere readable.
Absolutely. And Andrew, you kind of went right into the next thing here. Exploring your worlds further. Is that something that you guys both have considered after what you're currently working on? Bryan, I know you'll be working in Power to the Stars for a little longer here, but for Andrew, who's already got 2 of the 3 books out, is that is something you kind of want to explore, maybe on another side of the world, or?
Oh yeah, that's definitely the plan. I did write a novella in a different side of the world, and I'm probably not going to release a novella, but I have already thought about other parts of the world and kind of different characters. And I was talking earlier about how the trilogy kind of has an A plot, but even that's tied to an even bigger plot. So I do want to do a Cosmere, Robin Hobb connected universe where we're going to pick up elsewhere with different characters, and there will be cameos of the characters that you know from Shadowbinders. So I have already thought more about characters. My stories always start with characters rather than the world and the setting, but I do kind of have bits where even in the Shadowbinders is referenced to other places that you will eventually get to see. So yeah, it's definitely something I've considered. And again, this is going back to our point about you need to have this foresight of looking ahead and knowing if you're going to do something like this, you need to reference other places. Well, you don't need to, but it's really cool for people to go back and go, oh, look, they mentioned this in book 1. And look at all this foreshadowing, which is something I really wanted to do and I really like. So kind of having not even it fleshed out, just names of places and rough geological biomes is just kind of where I am currently with the setting. However, I have got some character and I have a lot of plot ideas for things because that is tied to kind of the A story of the trilogy.
And then Bryan, I mean, I'm assuming maybe in the future, even with the current series, we might see more of like some of these other planets a little more as well.
Oh yeah, I my plan by the end, whether it be in the novella or in one of the actual main books, is to show you at least a little bit of a glimpse of each planet. I'm hoping anyone who's read the stories, they kind of know these planets are all named after prophets. Those prophets play an integral part of what is the main protagonist's journey. And so he's going to kind of have to touch a little bit on each planet to perform his task. But yeah, in terms of like a bigger picture, I'm probably the opposite of Andrew in the sense of I'm hoping to show this as much as I can in the main series and novellas related to it, but I don't have any, I'm I think that's kind of enough. I'm not going to plan for this grand across the galaxy or across the. I mean, this could change.
Cosmere sphere.
Yeah, exactly. The just that's not in my plan. I would see myself more when I'm finished with this series, diving into a completely different genre. I've always loved I've loved urban fantasy, epic fantasy. I'd love to write something like that. I love dystopian thrillers, stuff like that. I would love to get into that. I have a little bit dabbled in writing with, I have probably like half a first draft written for a kind of dystopian sci-fi thriller that I think would be pretty cool. But yeah, I think that would be my plan when I'm done with the series, is kind of divert into something completely different from it.
Yeah. Getting ahead of myself because I haven't actually published anything yet, but I actually do have a side cyberpunk series on the side that's kind of tied into what I'm currently writing too, but it is going to be a separate series, probably not as long as what I'm currently writing. This is going to be my main thing, but I'm kind of toying with it when I need a break from what I'm currently writing and I just need to like do something different. That's what I go to. So yeah.
Cyberpunk seems pretty popular nowadays.
Yeah, I know.
Cyberpunk's great. I mean, we've got Aaron in the chat.
Yeah, I was going to say, is Aaron still in the chat?
He is, yeah.
I know somebody's ears were burning. Amazing cover.
It's
to
gorgeous.
Aaron's book there. So I guess in the end, would you say there is it hard or is it different, do you think, in world building a science fiction aspect where it's a little more broader? Like Bryan, it's probably difficult for you to have like maps and all that of worlds because you don't necessarily have, you'd have like 11 different maps probably for 11 different planets, whereas Andrew, has the one world. So do you think there is like, what are the similarities, I guess, or the differences when world building for these two genres that are kind of interconnected in a lot of ways anyway?
I think there's a lot of similarities, a lot of differences. When you touch on maps, I really wanted in my second book to kind of have a map of kind of like, the Red Rising map where it shows the solar system. I wanted something like that, but I didn't end up, it doesn't, mine involves four different main solar systems. So it's, it was I don't know, I felt it would have looked a little weird, and it didn't involve all of them in my second story. So maybe down the line I'll add that. But it's definitely a complexity. It leaves me debating what to do. Because, for instance, my third book, my third book, a massive battle is going to take place on one of the planets, and there's going to be a lot of strategy involved with the landscape, stuff like that. So it's hard to write something like that and not get a map thrown into the book, right? I know if I'm reading that, I'm thinking of the last Wheel of Time book. I'm constantly flipping back to that map, like, where's this plateau? What is this rise? Where's that river? What are they talking about? So, that's something I definitely have to consider for my third. As of this point, being sci-fi where you don't always see maps, I've been able to get away with not doing it, but there are the fantasy elements of mine. I think it's eventually going to have to be added in there. But in the overall grand scheme of things, to me, the major differences are, I feel like fantasy, sometimes you're a little more restricted in the sense of epic fantasy is more so like medieval. So you got to kind of attribute your story to that, or urban fantasy, you have to attribute to kind of contemporary times, stuff like that. Whereas sci-fi, I feel like futuristic terms, especially with mine being the technology and the people just revolve heavily around the magic system. It leaves open a whole door of opportunities of how to just create things, create creatures, create places to kind of mesh all this into the story.
How about you, Andrew?
Yeah, 100%. I do think they're very similar in that I do feel like sometimes it is just a different skin. It's very, very, like, the basic concepts on both sides are very, very similar. I do think with sci-fi, it's a wee bit more complicated when you come to maps and you're thinking about solar systems. That's quite complicated, and you need several maps. Or I know some maps actually have this works with both fantasy and sci-fi, because you can get fancy with building maps or towns, and it's the same with sci-fi. You can get ships and things. So I do think a lot of the time it is very similar, but there's definitely differences in kind of the nuances and thinking behind it, more so with like solar systems and complicated star things that sound way too complicated for me to understand.
Absolutely. I imagine with like specifically with Bryan, it's like I would like a blueprint as your map of like a ship or something like that kind of thing.
Oh yeah, I'm a terrible artist, but I have horrible sketch drawings that at least outline it enough that I can see. I mean, that's been some of the tougher things for me. Granted, it's a very, especially my second book is very heavy sci-fi themed. There's space battles, stuff like that, involving fleets of ships. But I'm not a science guy by any. That was my worst class in growing up in grade school. Was I was always good in all the others. I just, for whatever reason, science didn't come naturally to me. So it took a bit of research to make sure I was at least doing it to a believable, someone's probably going to find something scientifically wrong with my stuff, but it's at least, I think, to a point where it'll believable for the majority. And again, I do have the luxury of the tech in my world building is completely revolved around the magic system. Everyone can use it. So everything about how their spaceships run revolves around it. Their faster than light travel is because of this magic that they have. And it opened up all other avenues of making it more interesting because it can't be reached on Earth or within a vicinity around it. So that opened up a door in my second book, especially where things are taking place a little more around Earth, where I had to work that in, that how are these ships still running? How are they still able to be used and stuff like that?
The other thing to consider with maps is, well, this is something that I kind of struggled with, was I got my map done while the first book is okay because most of the plot points take place in cities and there isn't a lot of travel between. But when you get into sequels and you're fleshing out the rest of the world, travel is a nightmare. You need to look at the map and make sure it makes sense. It's like, it takes them a day to get here, but it takes them 2 days to get there. That doesn't work. And I imagine sci-fi is just as complicated because you'll have different modes of transport and things like that, even across planets. And yeah, that's something that's a nightmare.
or just do what I do, where time magic is very prominent in my series. So there's a lot of portal hopping.
Yeah, I mean, I'm able to make mine.
I was that way too, Andrew. I was like, I don't know distances. I don't know how long it should take for people to get here. As much as I enjoyed reading The Wheel of Time, I felt like there was times where it's like, all right, these guys took forever to get to this city, and now suddenly they're getting to this city. It seems like quicker, kind of thing. And I felt like sometimes consistency on getting to a place seems to change sometimes. So
it's like the Game of Thrones TV show. In the early seasons, we spent whole seasons of them traveling from one place to the other, and by like the final 2 seasons, one episode they went from one end of the continent to the other.
Yeah, for sure. And nothing, of course, has changed. Everything is still going on 10 minutes later, kind of thing.
But with mine, I kind of built myself in this little rule structure that at least when it's traveling to close to one of the planets that may not be allies with or something like that, there's kind of a rule across the whole universe that I have that you can't travel any closer than 30 or Vintara is the name of the planet, 30 hours of that planet's time within that, it gives them proper time. Otherwise it's considered almost a hostile act.
There is, we still try to maintain like some sort of like rules and laws, even though we're dealing with magic, fantasy and all that. And I always want to make sure that, I consistently stay to those kind of guidelines I set for myself when I'm world building. Dealing a little bit with a scientific thing like you brought up, Brian. I'm not scientifically inclined either. And, starting my book off with a supernova, despite it being magically implemented, there's still a scientific aspect to how a supernova goes off and how long whether it collapses into a white dwarf or if it goes into a black hole, which it does the latter in mine. So getting those scientific facts and doing that research is kind of like what initially I wanted to stay away from when I was writing fantasy. I was like, I don't want to deal with like rules and regulations, but when you're writing fantasy, you're still going to have that. So,
yeah, there's a lot of Googling involved. Yeah, especially in the editing phase. I don't know why I find that happens more in the editing phase for me than actually writing it.
Oh, Brian, do you think it would be possible to get around the map problem with a good illustration of a battle? Oh, there you go.
I think an illustration of the battle would be absolutely epic. Especially what goes into, Chris, you've read my books, what goes into the intricacies of their fights, how the magic mixes with kind of futuristic guns, but also mixes with swords and any other sort of handheld combat weapons. But yeah, I don't know if it will it'll be cool. It'll help them picture the scene more. But I don't know, like, for instance, my third book, it's a certain POV is going to kind of be spread throughout the book, and the battles drawn out. Different battles are going to take place over the course of what is one large planetary fight, I guess you could say. My favorite TV series by far is Band of Brothers, and so that I'm actually like rewatching it now, or trying. It's a long series, so I'm getting it in when I can, but trying to rewatch it to kind of jot notes down and take down ideas, or how I'm going to implement many of the tones from that into how this movement. It's basically they're fighting for a continent on one of the planets that's going to decide who takes this planet, and I'm trying to do that in the best way possible, but also mix it with what are kind of war themes and strategies that we know on our world.
For sure. Aaron, what's the strangest thing you had to research in your story? Andrew?
This is always such a good question. I've had it before, and I can never remember. My memory is like a fish. It's gone. But I do think the radiation stuff was really not interesting. It was pretty messed up. And one of the things I did look into for a certain plot point in book 2 was kind of the dodgy experiments, kind of off, like secret black op type experiments with radiation and things like that. And looking at that, some of the stuff that's happened is just really messed up and horrific. So definitely that was probably the worst thing. I can't even remember. There was one specific experiment that someone told me, oh, you need to look into this. And I regret looking into this. I googled it. Oh man.
It's a can of worms.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. It's always the gruesome stuff. Especially in, I think, the sci-fi fantasy realms. For me, it's probably, I would say one is, at least these are the top ones coming to my head. One was kind of researching how a body would burn in space, or would it actually burn in space, or would it just snuff out with the lack of oxygen, that type of stuff. And another one too is, I remember I just did recently for my novella, there's a scene, someone gets pierced in the neck, and I kind of was trying to research what sounds would make if someone had a gaping hole in their neck, if they'd still kind of make the sounds out of their mouth or out of their neck. It's disgusting. And, it's the type we always hear the jokes. The FBI is going to be knocking out our door for researching it, but it's the type of stuff that you want to get right. I don't want to say that it's, there's a gaping hole in their neck and they're talking, or this certain sound is coming out of their mouth, when that's not physically feasible.
How quickly a body voids their bowels was another one I had to look up, because it was to do with like the smell of a dead body very quickly after they died. And I was like, would they smell that quickly? The answer is yes.
Yeah, I think I agree with all of these. It was all about anatomy of the human body, whether it be if they're dead or, decomposing, or they're stabbed or something like that. It's, I mean, I guess it's not strange. I think we all, especially if we write any sort of like battle scene or military scene, we're gonna have to probably look at it if we're not like medical experts on any of that stuff. We'll have to start all over again because Timothy just showed up. So. Anything else you guys want to share about your world? We are reaching the hour point. I said I would give you guys an hour and a half. I feel like we've really delved into like historical building the worlds. Anything you maybe want to share with like new writers, about world building that, people like me who's still in their first process of their first book. Anything you want to share with those writers that are working on their first book about planning their world out in world building?
I would just say, I don't think we were talking about this on here. I think we were talking about it a little bit beforehand, but I would just say what we discussed beforehand of, the first book is always going to be, don't get too stressed out or bogged down. If with that first book, you feel like there's all this stuff, it's not coming together. You're going to learn the and granted, I'm saying this, I've only written 2 full books and, you know, a novella that'll soon be out, but so I'm no pro myself, but I definitely realized after doing the full process of the first book, how much easier it is to go from there. You learn kind of your bad habits. You learn a lot of the fine points of what you should more so be doing by working with editors, by working with beta readers. You know, you focus on these things in that first book, which, yes, it seems like it's never ending. It seems like it takes forever. But once you get over that hump, I do think the books after that start to, at least your writing style starts to flow a little more smoothly. You know, I'm getting to a point where I feel like it's hard to say because the novella I just did is much smaller in scale than the 2 main books that I wrote, but I felt like it went much more smoothly in the sense of I start to have my process down more. I'm not doing things that necessarily aren't things I don't need to do. I'm not wasting time. I'm trusting more things that the first book I tried to handle everything. Even though I was working with editors, even though I was working with beta readers, I tried to still, between every single draft, handle everything myself. And I'm realizing more now that you kind of got to find your good beta readers, find your good editors, and just trust in their process. And that eliminates some of the work on yourself. It's what you're paying them, or at least in the editor end, it's what you're paying them for, is to, so you don't have to go through and get perfect sentence structure and stuff like that. I mean, you're still going to want to, but you don't have to put as much, I guess, effort into it.
Yeah, and to do with world building in particular, I do think there's kind of a scale of some people are really afraid of info dumping and some people who don't really care and just do a bunch of info dumping. But I do want to say, if you are like afraid of info dumping, really wary about your world building, and you read like Sanderson stuff, you're like, how do they do it? Usually the difference between info dumping, world building, and just building the world is execution. A lot of the time it's timing, it's when you put down the information, it's how you put down the information, it's how it's tied to the plot and the characters. So I wouldn't worry too much about info dumping, and I would look more into how are you getting this information across. It goes to the earlier point about it really being to do with communication and getting the points across. My novella, I was really worried about my novella because it's only 18,500 words, just over 50 pages. And I wanted to introduce this subculture. They have a ton of like unique rituals, and even just how their society works is quite bizarre. And I was writing it thinking, is this too much? Is this too much for a novella? Because I had this world building and it fits with the plot, but I was worried it was just going to be too much for the reader in such a short period of time, because I didn't really talk about it in the main books. It was just kind of hinted at. However, because it's so integral to the plot and just the way that that information is communicated, things like in this Urdal society, there aren't really blood parents don't look after their kids. All the children born in a certain year are brought together and looked after by one mother. And she's kind of trained to become this best mother ever and look after all the kids born in this year. And trying to fit something like that in a plot, trying to just like shove that information in, it would be very jarring. But I had the character going in and speaking to one of these mothers because the plot needed that to happen, and he saw the room with the chamber where all these children slept, and then he was thinking about the Torresians in the rest of the city and how they didn't do that. And it's finding ways to get this information across without just chucking it down as a block of text, like a historical, passage of information. It's very much how much can you tie to the world, how much can you tie to the characters, the themes. It's all about kind of that synergy of wrapping all these things together with world building in particular. But also what Bryan said is an iterative process. Don't stress about the first draft. Just get the first draft down and then build on there. You learn so much from getting feedback on your writing, way more than you can get reading writing books or anything like that. I do think there's the experience of writing and getting feedback on that writing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And to go with what Andrew said, it's about finding that balance, but it's all especially in terms of info dumping. I know that's most people's worry. Even that, like anything in books, is subjective. I have early on phase of my first book. There's a back-to-back chapters where it is a lot of info given, they're given in two different ways. One is kind of a news conference that is said to the whole world after this attack takes place. And the next one is the main protagonist meeting with a person from these worlds and them discussing something. There is a lot of info given there. And I have had the end of the spectrum where I know readers have hated it. They have said, this is classic info dumping, blah, blah, blah. I've had every reaction in between, though. I've had the other end where people were like, I loved it. That's what pulled me into the story. I felt rooted to these planets. And, you know, there was the in between where I remember like one of my top beta readers he goes, you know, it is a little bit of info dumping, but it's believable in the scheme of your story. And I think that's what's important to do as a writer is, you know, your story the best. If you think it's not being forced, if you think it's a believable aspect in a way to say it, then I think it'll work in your story. It's you just it can't be consistent throughout. You know, it can't be that's the one end where I think then it's maybe not debatable if you're just every chapter is just relating loads and loads and dumps of information. But, you know, a little bit here, a little bit there, make it believable to your story, and you'll be all set.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's definitely different ways of approaching giving information in a more entertaining way. I just recently read Riven Earth by Zamar Amur, and he utilizes a character's journal to relay maybe some of the world a little bit, but it's, you know, done through the journey kind of thing. And I think that's maybe why a lot of people usually have like that naive POV character to be the one to relay that first experience of seeing some of the things that are in the world, because usually if we're known to something, we don't share that, you know, usually with people around us. It's just an automatic thing for us. But yeah, I agree. And one of the things I've noticed going back into my second draft was info dumping, and I was calling it out prior, and when I had it reviewed by a couple of a writers group, they said the exact same things. You know, a lot of maybe proper nouns are being too many proper nouns are being introduced or something like that. So, you know, definitely it's something that I was proud that I was able to call out prior to that. So recognizing those aspects of when maybe it's a little too much as compared to information that might be needed at the time. And Andrew, I commend you on writing novellas, because I don't think I would be able to I'm too, everything's always like laid out in and I don't know if I could tell a short story like that with getting everything out in the end like that. I'd be too wordy, I think.
Definitely a different kettle of fish. Yeah. But I do think this also ties into the show don't tell. I feel like that's a really trendy term to kind of throw about. And I think it's the same. It's very much on how it's done. I do think sometimes you do need to tell. I think writers are afraid to tell now because they hear the phrase so often. But it's definitely, there's times where you do need to just get information across. And you can still do it in an entertaining way, in a way that's tied to the story. However, I would say if you're a new writer, don't be afraid, especially in early drafts, to just have these in. And if it's pointed out from other people, then yeah, you might want to adapt that. But don't be afraid, and don't really watch out for these things if you think it works in the story itself.
Sure.
For sure. And yeah, I guess there are authors that, you know, do that. And I guess it's just a matter of how those nouns are presented in the way that is not going to be confusing to the reader, for sure. All right. Guys, anything else you want? Any final thoughts? Or are you good?
I think we're good.
I think we covered most of it.
Yeah. Awesome. I want to thank you both very much for jumping on this first episode. I want to keep the series going. Maybe you guys will come back on for another episode in the future. We'll discuss maybe something else. You guys will both be further along, I'm sure, in your series by then. Yeah. Andrew, where can people find you?
Yeah, we'll come back. We'll be like, yeah, everything we said in that video was wrong. Ignore past us. We're idiots.
I need
We
to
have a couple
update
books
my,
published. You should be listening to us about everything.
I need to update my world building.
Yeah. Oh man, it's published. Yeah. So, and the other, yeah. I'm not going to go into it. Yes, I'm Andrew Watson. You can find me on YouTube. You can find me on Instagram at The Fool's Tale. You can buy my book, Harbinger of Justice. Most places you buy books, Amazon, Blackwell's, Barnes & Noble, most online retailers have access to buying them. And you can download my prequel novella, Silence of Silver, completely for free by signing up for my newsletter.
Awesome. Brian.
And I am Bryan Wilson. First, Chris, thanks for having us on. It's an honor to be on the first episode of this. I hope it's something that blows up and becomes huge, and I can say I was on the first one ever, so that's pretty cool. But yeah, no, you can find me on Instagram at brian.wilson.author. My series is Power of the Stars. I'm also on Twitter, bwilsonauthor, and I have my first novella, which is related to my series. You don't have to have read the main books to enjoy it, and that's going to be releasing July 30th, and it will also be free to all my newsletter subscribers, which you can subscribe at my website at bryanwilsonauthor.com, and that's Brian with a Y.
And that is that novella is Princess of Uldir.
Yes.
Am I pronouncing Uldir right? Okay.
Yes, Uldir. Yeah.
Awesome. Guys, thank you very much in the chat. If you guys are catching the playback of this live stream, feel free to drop any additional comments down below. I will also have all the links for where you can find Andrew's YouTube channel, as well as his books and Brian's books, also linked in the description below. So I thank you everybody for showing up today. When we have international people on like Andrew, I know it's in for the North America, it's a weird time, but I wish it would be nicer if it was in the evening. I wish I'd be over there in a heartbeat.
Yeah, sorry for the weird timing.
No, it's I have a panel of North Americans, all within Eastern, Central, Mountain, and I'm Pacific, so that's going to be that's interesting anyway. But no, I thank you for your time, Andrew. I know it's a different time for you, and Brian, of course, thank you both very much for being part of episode 1. Chat, thank you as well.
Thank you very much.
Peace out.
This was kind of fun.